The smartest leaders give away power. We're going to see this today as Jonathan takes off his gear and gives it to David. Today, we'll learn how giving away what you control can accelerate God's mission. Welcome to Serving Second. My name is Dr. Toussaint Williams. I'm a pastor, an author, a leadership coach, and I serve leaders who serve leaders. This show equips second chair leaders, vice presidents, associates, assistants, assistant pastors, chief of staff, wherever you may serve to thrive where God has placed you. Here we're going to talk about practices that you can apply in your day-to-day life. And most importantly, I'm going to give you a challenge to act. Here we go. We've seen Jonathan wrestle with inheritance, birth order, and the right to the throne. Now we're going to see something a little bit different. Some of you may remember a point guard for the Utah Jazz. His name was John Stockton. Now, listen, I am not a Utah fan. In fact, I grew up hating the Jazz because they were the team that terrorized my Houston Rockets. They were the antithesis to everything we wanted to be and everything we wanted to do. I hated the Utah Jazz, but there was one guy on the team that made a difference, that made me sit back and say, man, I enjoy watching basketball. He wasn't the tallest. He wasn't the strongest. He wasn't the fastest, but he was cerebral in that he knew how to share the basketball. And what made John Stockton so special is that he knew how to orchestrate his team and share the ball so that his teammates, namely Karl Malone, would be in a position where they could put the ball in the basket. Today, we're talking about sharing. I told you before, I'm a competitive person. And this idea of sharing goes along with some of the things that we naturally don't do well. In fact, you can go to any preschool or you can babysit your niece or your nephew or just watch your own kids and remember the times where they didn't want to share the ball or they grabbed the water bottle away from their sibling or they pushed somebody off the swing. We do not share well naturally. I firmly believe that sharing is something that has to be learned, has to be taught, something that has to be cultivated. And for leaders that are in second chair situations, for individuals that may be in the second seat where you're an assistant, you're an associate, you're a vice. And let me also say this, for many of us who are watching, you are someone who is naturally in a service type of leadership role. But also for the leaders who are watching, the individuals that find themselves as number ones, as the CEOs, as the presidents, as the individuals that have the last say. One of the reasons why serving second is so important is for you to understand how to lead those who are following you, how to understand that you're not the team, you're a part of the team. And so in learning and growing with us on the Serving Second podcast, you can understand how to better enhance, how to better equip, and most importantly, how better achieve your outcomes when you make a priority to serve those who you're working with. Today, we're looking at 1 Samuel chapter 18 and verse 4. In this text, y'all, listen, I've been in the Bible since college. I've been studying different elements of biblical leadership. And some of you may have been listening to this that aren't real biblical, that aren't real, super spiritual. Family, even if you're not spiritual, take this as an ancient Hebrew proverb, just like you would an ancient Chinese proverb. Just listen to the principles that are found in this leadership context. Now, remember, Jonathan was Saul's oldest son. Jonathan was the individual who's supposed to be the next in line, but God calls David to be the next king instead of Jonathan. When I read this text, it totally transformed my idea of what it means to be first and how to ultimately serve so that we can accomplish the mission. Notice what the Bible says in 1 Samuel 18 and verse number 4. Start at verse 3. Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. Notice this next verse. Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing and gave it to David, along with his tunic, even his sword, his bow, and his belt. Picture this. Jonathan makes one of the boldest moves in all of Scripture. We aren't told if everyone knew that David was going to be king. But Jonathan makes this move in 1 Samuel chapter 18 and verse 4 that totally transforms the game. It removes any possible tension that could be between them. And Jonathan does this. He strips himself of his robe, his armor, his sword, his bow, and his belt, and gives them to David. Jonathan is a soldier. Jonathan is a leader of soldiers. And Jonathan not just gives his bow and his sword, he literally takes off his robe and his armor to give them to David. Now, I want you to know, before we go further, every item has meaning. Every item that Jonathan gave up indicated status, authority, and protection. So to give these items to David says, I will resource you to become what God calls you to be. But it also does this. It causes Jonathan now to be vulnerable to David. All right, don't miss that. Don't go past the fact that he gave. But when Jonathan gives his robe and when Jonathan gives his sword, when Jonathan gives his bow, he now is saying, David, I'm not going to fight you. In fact, I'm giving up everything so that you can be successful. Can you imagine what that looked like? Before we go any further, let me not go too far, not go too fast. This thing is messing me up. We may even have a second part to this later on down the road. Notice the symbols in the things that Jonathan gave. The first, Jonathan gives him his robe. The robe, unlike a sports jacket or even a basketball hoodie that sometimes we wear, the robe symbolized Jonathan's royal identity. More than likely, it had his name etched inside, second in command. Probably had Jonathan's name there and had probably his family crest or his family seal. He took off his robe and he gives it to David, indicating, I'm going to give you my covering. Jonathan, in taking off his robe, says, David, I'm going to make sure that you're covered. And family, if you are a part of this journey, if you're somebody who really is intentional about making sure your team, your mission, your church, your organization succeeds, you've got to make sure that you are covering for somebody else. You're going to make sure that they are taken care of. Number two, Jonathan gives up his armor. Jonathan, this warrior, this individual who's trained for battle, gives up his protection and his readiness to be in charge. Jonathan essentially says, I'm going to guard you with what guarded me. So at this point, without a robe and without armor, Jonathan cannot fight effectively as he used to. But he makes sure that David has the ability to have the finest armor available. So Jonathan shows David, hey, I'm not going to fight you. I'm with you. I'm for you. And I want to make sure that you are protected. But not only does he give him his armor, his defenses, he now gives him a sword. The sword is the authority. The sword is when you go on offense. The sword is when you're about to go to battle, to go to blows. A king's son giving his weapon was like giving his permission to lead. My dad, who was in Vietnam, on Friday nights, grabbed my brothers and I, and he would tell us stories about different exploits that would happen in his years in Vietnam. He would tell us some of the stories that would sometimes make him cry. Sometimes he would tell us stories where he would pull out old photographs of his guys in the platoon and how they would be in the rice fields for hours on time and being on patrol and watching. And one thing he said that I never forgot, and I've never been in the military and haven't been in a war, but he said this and it never left me. He said, no matter where you go, even when you're on the toilet, you keep your weapon near you. Jonathan chooses to give his weapon away. What are your weapons that you can use to share with your leader? What are some things that you can do to be intentional about making sure your leader knows, hey, I'm not competing with you. I'm going to do everything I can to make sure that you're successful. Jonathan gives up his armor, he gives up his robe, he gives up his sword, and he also gives up his bow, like a bow and arrow. This idea where Jonathan gives up his ability for range and for vision and for reach. Jonathan offers his ability to strike from a distance. There were different ways you can fight. And Jonathan said, by giving you my sword, I'm going to show you, I'm not going to fight you from up close. By my bow means even when we're at a distance, I'm not going to fight you. And family, this is one thing I want to make sure that we understand. This concept of fighting up close is like, I'm not going to say anything negative about my leader, my boss. I'm not going to say anything negative about the one who's in charge, at least not in front of them. But sometimes we take that bow. We say when we turn the corner, when they're not here or when they're off doing something else, do we take pot shots or do we sometimes find ourselves trying to attack from a distance? And family, by Jonathan giving up his bow, does major work in showing how vulnerable he is. But not only does he give up his bow, the last piece he gives up is his belt, his ability to hold things together. Jonathan gives up an identity that shows a symbol of discipline and integrity. Everything that was essential for Jonathan to be successful, he gives to David, showing not just to David, but the rest of the command, the rest of the nation, the rest of the soldiers that says, hey, this is our leader. This is the one we're going to get behind. Every piece spoke to something, and Jonathan gave each one of them freely. But hey, listen, this is 2025. We don't shoot with bow and arrows. We don't give each other coats or bows. But what does gear look like today? What gear do you have that you can give up so that your team can be successful, to show that there's not any competition? It looks probably like maybe some templates on your computer, maybe access codes or contacts, or it looks like sharing contacts of people who are key decision makers in your organization. It shows that you're going to give up decision-making authority or budgetary lines and meeting invitations or simple insider knowledge. This says, I'm not going to withhold anything that's not going to make you successful, that ultimately is not going to make all of us successful. Anything that you control that if shared can accelerate somebody else is what would be equivalent to gear in our day and age. Too often leaders cling to gear thinking that it defines them, thinking that by holding this, I will make sure that I'm relevant and I will not be able to be pushed aside or cast away. But Jonathan shows us true strength comes when we give our power away. Jonathan shows that he's in charge by serving, by giving everything he had that was of power, of value, of importance, by giving it away. So what are some lessons we can learn from this? Number one, power shared is power multiplied. When you hand off tools, when you hand off gear, others move faster. Jonathan never lost influence. Jonathan multiplied impact. Jonathan, still remaining the king's son, never lost his status in the royal family. Jonathan always remained in charge, but he chose to serve. You don't lose influence, you multiply impact. The robe says, I cover you. The armor says, I protect you. The sword says, I trust you. The bow says, I extend you. The belt says, I steady you. Second chair leaders know the kingdom wins when resources flow freely. Lesson number 2, we have to learn to resource without strings. So catch this, fam. Jonathan didn't hand over his robe with a condition. David, if I give you this, I need you to make sure you take care of me. I need you to make sure that you got my back. I want to make sure. No, he didn't say, remember me when you rise, and when you get to that next spot, I need you to make sure that Jonathan gave and gave freely. He gave it clean. Too many leaders give those what we call invisible strings, trying to keep the score or making sure that you exact payback, hinting at future favors. But when God asks you to resource someone, it's not a negotiation, it's obedience. Yep, I'm going to say it again. When God asks you to resource someone, it's not negotiation, it's obedience. It's you saying, God gave me this, and I'm going to give it to you. And I'm not trusting that person I'm giving it to. I'm trusting that God is going to take care of me just like he did in the past. Lesson number 3, trusting over territory. Jonathan gave gear that symbolized territory, authority, and future. He trusted God enough to release it. And I'm going to stay here for just a second because I want to make sure we don't miss the fact that in these experiences, God is still working in our lives. That God still wants you and I to know where our source of strength comes from. And it's not in a title and it's not in a position. It's when we submit to his will and his way. So when you choose to trust God with your future, you don't need to hoard. When you trust God with your future, you don't need to hoard. You don't need to have extended storages and stuff in the garage. What you're simply saying or what is being communicated is, God, I trust you to provide for me. You're saying, just like Jesus did, that you see the lilies out in the field, you see the birds out there. God provides for them. In giving this away, I believe God's going to provide for me. So when we choose to trust God with our future, we don't need to hoard. When we choose to trust God with our future, you don't need to hoard. What looks like loss is actually stewardship of God's bigger plan. Let me say that again. What looks like loss is actually stewardship in God's plan. So let's look at 1 Samuel 18:4 one more time. Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing and gave it to David, along with his tunic and even his sword, his bow, and his belt. Let that sit in for just a second. The heir apparent transferring his symbols of power of God's, the heir apparent to the throne is transferring his symbols of power to God's anointed man for that time. This humility, this obedience, this covenant is on display, not just a personal thing. Everybody knows, or people are going to ask, hey, where's your bow? Where's your sword? Hey, bro, where's your robe? And when they see David walking with it, they can say, I see the level of sacrifice that was being made. All right. So here we go. We're talking about real things now. We're making it practical. My question for you today, identify 5 assets you control. This could be contacts. This could be meetings, budget items, knowledge, or systems. Pick one of those, and I want you to hand it to somebody responsible this week. Share it with them without strings attached. That's it. You're identifying 5 assets that you control, and you're going to identify one person that is responsible that you can share it with, one person that you can do it without strings attached. Hey, I'm going to bring you into this inner circle. I'm going to allow you to see the things that I deal with so that you can lead as well. Number 2, I want to challenge you to create a resource that outlives you. This may be a template, maybe a checklist, maybe a process document, a standard operation procedure, something that goes beyond your time at your organization or your position or your area of influence. Build something that others can use many times over. This is how second chair leaders, this is how second seat individuals multiply beyond their immediate influence, is when we share what God has given to us. Some of you may say, listen, hey, Tucson, man, if I give this away, what am I going to have left? I hear what you're saying. It makes sense. I see from a Bible perspective, but at the end of the day, if I give everything away, what am I going to have? What's going to be less? And here's what I want to share with you. If you give what God has given you away, you'll still have your identity in Christ. You will still have your calling, because remember, your gear is not who you are. It's what God gave you to steward. You may be saying, well, what if I do this and I put all this work into it and other people misuse it? I'm giving this stuff away, but they may not treat it properly. And I want to challenge you and let you know that that's not your scoreboard. You obey God by releasing it and trust him to handle the outcomes. You throw up your hands and say, listen, this is information. You're nodding your head. You may be riding your car and you're listening to this and saying, okay, I get it. But real talk, what if I become invisible? What if I do all this work and they no longer need me, or I'm no longer necessary? What happens when I give all of the things that I worked so hard for, or I give away the things that make me who I am? And I want to let you know by responding to that this way. There's a reason why we have this second. I want to respond this way. That's the reason why we have the Serving Second podcast. Because we're learning from a biblical perspective that Jonathan is remembered precisely because he gave the gear away. Don't miss this. Legacy outlives the spotlight. Legacy outlives the spotlight. So today we're thanking God that Jonathan's courage to give away what he could have clutched teaches us to identify the gear that we hold. It teaches us that we can hand it off freely. We can remove our fear and replace it with trust, believing that God is in control, and we can use our resources to advance and accelerate the mission where God has placed us. So here we go. Reviewing now. Jonathan gave up his robe, his armor, his sword, his bow, and his belt. Each symbol meant something. Each symbol was an indication for those watching that I'm trusting this individual who's trusting God. We learned today that power shared is power multiplied, and true leadership resources others without strings. This week, we're listing your assets and we're handing one off, and we're building resources that outlive us. Like we say every week, family, thank you so much for hanging out with us. This is now your time to subscribe on YouTube, to follow us on Instagram at Serving Second Podcast, and repeat your covenant line. Remember, the mission I serve is bigger than my title. That's right. The mission that I serve is bigger than my title. This is the Serving Second Podcast, where second chair leaders create first place outcomes. I'm your host, Dr. Toussaint Williams. Thank you for joining us. Look forward to seeing you next week. God bless.